Iranians will feel completely vindicated by what's happened. You get threatened and you threaten back and things de-escalate. And where are we now? Is the Strait of Hormuz open? No, it's not. The only thing that's changed is that the threat that Trump was talking about hasn't materialized.
This is a regime that is now getting ready for a long fight. Even if both sides declare mission accomplished, the Pandora's box has been opened. There is no, for the Iranian regime, there's no going back to how things were.
How do the Gulf states feel now? Their whole dream of a sort of Fabergé egg existence in the middle of a dangerous neighborhood has been shattered. Can that be rebuilt?
It takes two to taco. So you can taco on your own, but you're going to need the Iranian government to play along.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast, once again coming to you from Jerusalem, although I'm happy to say not quite as noisy as it was last time we spoke. So has Taco Trump struck again? The president is denying that he's chickened out of striking Iranian power plants if the Strait of Hormuz stays shut. It's all about good and productive talks, he said today. Iran doesn't agree. They think that he's backed down after their own firm warning. Either way, the markets loved it. Gas and oil prices fell dramatically on the announcement almost immediately. Israel, maybe not so much. It is still striking what it calls the heart of Tehran and says that bombing will continue for weeks. So is the first sign that the war could be ending or not? Well, to discuss all this, and there's plenty to discuss, I'm joined now by the former senior diplomat in the US State Department, Jennifer Gavito, Renad Mansour, senior fellow in the Middle East program at Chatham House, and our very own Helia Ebrahimi, Economics Editor. Another very busy day here with lots of things happening all the time. Let's start, first of all, with Trump's extraordinary post this morning as the markets were waking up in New York, and some of them going to bed in Asia, but also then what he followed up on the tarmac in Palm Beach, this sort of unbelievable weave that I think went on for 45 minutes, where he produced enough headlines to last an entire month. So first of all, to you, Jen, when you heard him talk about this, kind of cessation of fighting, or they didn't call it a ceasefire, and the pause in the bombing, did you believe it? Did you believe that there were talks behind it? What did you make of it?
Yeah, I believe it. I think that this is a sign that there is engagement. I'm not surprised that the Iranians are positioning themselves as well. Jumping way ahead of where we are today, I think any off-ramp is going to have to come with some face-saving measures for all the participants. And so each of those positioning to frame this as they can sell to their publics, including for President Trump being described as chickening out. That makes a lot of sense to me. That being said, there, I think, are divergent objectives that remain between Israel and the United States in particular. So whether we are on our way to an off-ramp or whether this is the opening salvo, I think remains to be seen.
So you think he chickened out?
I don't know that I think he chickened out. I think he's looking at the popularity, which is very low, and the economic impacts on both the United States and globally, and is rightly looking at ways to get out of this pickle that he has found himself in. So I don't know if it's chickening out so much as demonstrating finally some flexibility in how you find an end to the conflict.
I mean, Renad, considering how much the regime has been hit by in Iran, 17,000 targets hit by the Israelis and by the Americans, much of their leadership annihilated, destroyed, as Trump likes to remind us. This is quite a victory for them, isn't it?
I guess one can call it a mission accomplished potentially moment, just like the Americans did in 2003. It's there is one aspect of this is the military aspect, and on strict military terms, yes, there is tactical, short-term wins. Of course, the U.S. and Israel were going to bomb and decapitate, but what we know is that the war doesn't end when the militaries declare victory. What we know is that conflicts will continue even after victories are declared. And that is the way that Iran sees this now. I think Iran understands now that the status quo that it was holding on to is no longer feasible, that the region is changing, and Iran is now becoming less of a predictable actor.
What they've shown is the power of geography And I guess they're kind of lucky with their geography. I'm talking about the Strait of Hormuz.
Geography is destiny, Matt. Geography is destiny.
And it is for them, but also and their ability through geography to hold, the world economy by a chokehold.
I think geography is certainly very important, of course. And, one of the unpredictable moves was, would Iran actually to stop, you work on the Strait of Hormuz and play this card, and it has played this card. I think there's another issue here as well beyond geography, which is history. And we know that the Trump administration did not really care about the history of this country, the history of these people. It was always looking forward, not thinking about who they are. And so now they're asking, wait a minute, why aren't they backing down? Why do they seem suicidal? Suicidal implies some kind of rationality, but it's based on both geography and a misunderstanding of Iran, which has existed in this geography for a long time before the Americans started coming in.
I mean, we've been talking about the economy a lot in the last few weeks, and it was astonishing to see the global impact of this war. People queuing up in Sri Lanka to fill their tuk-tuks with gas. In Thailand, the newsreaders were taking off their jackets, trying to advertise the fact that you can live in a studio without air conditioning, et cetera, et cetera. It really had a global impact. And I guess the markets were driven to very much the edge of a nervous breakdown without going into the numbers, because they change, on a minute-by-minute basis.
They do at the moment, Matt. They do at the moment.
On a tweet-by-tweet basis.
On a tweet-by-tweet, exactly right.
Post by post, although maybe they've calmed down a bit now. But tell me about the state of mind of the markets this morning as this dawn post appeared.
Well, look, it's been complete whiplash in the markets, Matt. You had this threat from Trump over the weekend that Iran had 48 hours to comply, otherwise they were going to escalate the war. You saw the price of oil, crude, tip up towards $114. Even American crude was going towards $100. The price of US debt was getting quite tasty, actually. And suddenly you saw Trump doing exactly what he's done every week, which is come out into the market before the US market opens and say, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. And suddenly you saw this dramatic fall in the price of oil. You saw a dramatic fall in the cost of debt interest for Americans, for Europeans, for Brits, in the cost of gas. But I have to tell you, Matt, that it has risen since. And this is because the market is digesting. What is the truth of this? Trump may say we're in these great talks.
Which is why I said at the beginning, do we believe this or not?
Do we believe this? Well, I think the market is not sure whether it can believe this. The problem is that when there are no fundamentals at play, then every headline leads the nose of where the market's going. I mean, the Iranians will feel completely vindicated by what's happened. You threaten them, you get threatened and you threaten back, and things de-escalate. And where are we now? Is the Strait of Hormuz open? No, it's not. Is the risk of energy supplies moving freely increased? Yes, it is. The only thing that's changed is that the threat that Trump was talking about over the weekend hasn't materialized. But, Matt, it takes two to taco. So you can taco on your own, but you're going to need the Iranian government to play along.
Nice one. I might have to steal that. Jen, I mean, let's talk about the Israelis briefly. I'm in Jerusalem. I've heard a couple of Israeli officials on the local channels this morning. I mean, I have to say, none of them sound particularly convinced. And there was that one moment when Trump said, we're not revealing the name of the person that we're negotiating with because he might get killed. And of course, you wonder, who would they be killed by? I mean, is it the Israelis, maybe the Americans, or maybe the Revolutionary Guard? So anyway, Jen, not everyone is on board with this. Where are the biggest obstacles?
Yeah, I mean, you could almost argue it takes three to taco. In that there are three parties to this conflict. And I think increasingly we are going to see divergence between the objectives of the United States and the objectives of Israel. For Israel from the beginning, regime change has been the objective. And that dates back, I would argue, 20 years. For the United States, I think, as Renad says, we are likely to get to a point out of necessity where the president claims military and operational victory and says that's exactly how we intended for this to unfold. We've achieved everything we set out to do. A little bit of revisionist history is likely to come into play. But for this conflict to end, Iran and Israel both have to play ball. And for Israel, I think there is a closing window of opportunity to eliminate Iran as a strategic threat, and that is their objective here. And so there's a world where they continue to strike, and that puts the United States in quite a difficult position in that its assets will continue to be targeted, its both allies will continue to be targeted, and so does that then risk the U.S. even if it tries to extract itself getting pulled back in?
But the Israelis could also take the win, couldn't they? I mean, they could say, thanks to the Americans, we've really managed to deplete Iran's military capabilities. We've destroyed the ring of fire in the region, Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis to some extent in Yemen. I mean, Iran, whatever is left of it, whatever's left of the regime, is fundamentally weakened, even though it's still just about standing and it's still resolved to continue somehow. It is not what it was.
But Matt, even Iran at this point can claim victory. And I was talking to an energy analyst earlier today who was discussing that maybe this is the point where both the US and the Iranian regime can say, look, we've survived. We've been vindicated. We've survived. We haven't outgunned the Americans, but we've outlasted them on the economic pain. And the Americans can say, as Trump did on the tarmac, we've replaced one supreme leader with another. We have, obliterated there.
I think that may in fact be where we're headed, but there are a couple of problems with that. The first is that there are 200 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that remain in Iranian possession. And so if you go back to the start of this conflict and what President Trump named as, among the many things that he claimed along the way were key U.S. objectives, dismantlement of the nuclear program was chief among them. And so, as far as I can tell, there has been no progress made towards dismantling further the nuclear program, which of course was the target of the 12-day war last summer. So you can claim victory, but that's still in place. You still have expertise retained. And now you have arguably a harder line regime coming into power that will change the long-term view on weaponization of the nuclear program and decide that the only course open to Iran to reestablish deterrence and ensure that this doesn't happen in the future is in fact development of a nuclear weapon. And so I hope that there is a de-escalation to be found, but I'm not sure that fundamentally Iran comes out of this as weak as you described. The other piece, of course, is the Gulf. And, as much as perhaps they wish that this cycle had not been set off, leaving the Gulf vulnerable in the future to disruptions of the Strait of Hormuz, potentially the Bab el-Mandeb, and certainly to Iranian willingness to attack its neighbors, I think is kind of a worst case scenario for them at this point. They've taken the economic pain, the dismantlement to a large degree of their energy. Of their energy infrastructure. And then, for the U.S. to potentially walk away leaves them in a very, very vulnerable position.
I hope you can all hear the bells of Jerusalem, by the way. It's that time of the evening, and it's very atmospheric here. But I'm not sure if they're the bells of long-term peace or just, a short-term deal. Renad, I mean, one of the questions that came up with, and Trump dealt with it in a sort of typically Trumpian way, was who he's actually negotiating with on the Iranian side, or rather who Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are negotiating with. And as I said before, he wouldn't give us the name. But tell us about what you think is going on inside the rump Iranian regime. Who's got the authority to talk to the Americans? Are they in danger for some of the hardline radicals who may not like the idea of a deal and are rather enjoying this chokehold on the world economy?
I think certainly what's become clear is the Iranian state was deeper than perhaps Trump and his advisors anticipated. That this is a state of institutions that have hierarchies, that have standard operating procedures, and that also we're preparing for this, particularly since last year's 12-day war in June 2025. So yes, there has been, the senior leadership has been decapitated. Yes, that will bring fragmentation, but there is a Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which is very much in control and very much continuing to lead on the war efforts. There is still a foreign minister. There is still a president. There are still, I mean, this is not a, yes, Khamenei was the supreme leader, but this is not a regime around a single person, like we could think in other countries. This is a regime that's incredibly deep, that has experience in this kinds of war. It fought an 8-year war with Iraq, which was incredibly, brutal and violent. This is a regime that is now getting ready for a long fight. Even if even if both sides declare mission accomplished, the Pandora's box has been opened. There is no, for the Iranian regime, there's no going back to how things were. There is no going back to the status quo. And I think for Israel as well, there is no going back either. So we're very much living in a time where things are changing on the ground. Realities are changing every day, but there is a regime still in Iran. Yes, hurt. Yes, more fragmented, but still driving.
The regime change was barely mentioned on the tarmac by Donald Trump in Palm Beach today. And of course, that was one of the original reasons why he went in. And I think he was, probably very inspired to go in by what he saw, on the streets of Tehran at the beginning of the year. So do you think that this means that the regime can now breathe a sigh of relief? Or is it possible that after this has calmed down a little bit, and people feel they can get back on the streets without being hit by American bombs or Israeli bombs, we might actually see that moment where enough people get together and say, let's get rid of the Ayatollahs?
I think it's an incredibly difficult question. Certainly, there were people, Iranians have want regime change. They want a better life. But at the same time, since those protests a few months ago, these are people who now have having their electricity cut, who have their food supplies cut, who have medicine cut. I mean, they are in survival mode. These wars, these sanctions, these regime change, they harm the people even more than they harm the regime. And I think because of that, these people have been even weakened. Yes, and it's a predicament, because when they did rise up in January, they were put down by the same regime. But at the same time, society is exhausted, is being bombed, doesn't have medicine, and I think history tells us that this is not the recipe for that type of democratic uprising.
I mean, it is exhausted and really stretched, Matt, because it's the people, you were talking about, or is Iran in a weaker state? But actually, they've just won sanctions relief on their oil. And there's some satellite imagery today showing the Kharj Island actually loading Iranian oil, now thanks to the White House, being sold sanction-free. That helps the Iranian regime. Doesn't help the Iranian people. The Iranian people are at risk of actually facing a worse economic climate and potentially a more hardline government.
Helia, I mean, Trump also mentioned the Gulf states, and he almost apologized to them and said, well, no one saw this coming, that the Iranians would lash out at the Gulf states. And I would say, well, actually, a few people did see that coming, but never mind. Let's park that somewhere else. But how do the Gulf states feel now? They have been exposed. Their whole dream of a sort of Fabergé egg existence in the middle of a dangerous neighborhood has been shattered. Can that be rebuilt, or will they always feel vulnerable? And will they become militarily much more aggressive, do you think, towards Iran should the Iranians try something again?
Well, I think they clearly are vulnerable, and that's been exposed. People are talking about the damage. The IEA says 40 infrastructure sites across the Gulf in terms of energy have been hit, but we don't know the extent of it. And there's some suggestion, how long term is the damage? Are we talking about months? Even if the war ends this week, are we talking about months? Are we talking about years? And if so, how long? I think you've got things like Dubai real estate at the moment just plummeting. So this, as you said, this Fabergé egg, this idea of these cocooned, high-tech, modern societies with high growth economies that are completely insulated, well, that's for the birds now.
Senior Iranian official saying to Reuters, the US has requested a meeting with Iran's parliament speaker Kalibaf on Saturday. Tehran has yet to respond. Tell us about the Speaker of the Parliament. How powerful is he? Does he represent, the wider rump regime? And is he putting himself into a bit of danger by having his name out there?
Yeah, I suppose anyone putting their name out there or negotiating then becomes a target for the U.S. and Israel. I think, look, these are people who are in the system who consider themselves not to be part of some of the more extreme elements of it, and who are trying to negotiate, who to some extent, whereas the more extreme wing of the system in Iran is looking for war, looking for continued conflict. This is their hard line. There are those in the system who are looking for off ramps, certainly, and although whether they admit it or not, there will be talks, and I think these types of individuals have historically in the Iranian system been the communicators or the messengers, more than actual negotiators.
Jen, it strikes me that the theme of the second Trump administration, whether it's Ukraine or Iran, is that there's an ongoing, almost permanent, round-the-clock battle for Trump's attention. To have Trump's ear, to persuade him that that your course is better than someone else's course. And in this case, it's the Israelis whispering into his ear, it's the Iranians whispering into the other ear, the Gulf states not quite sure which ear to whisper into. Is that what's going on here?
I think to some degree, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly think that describes how we got into this, right? Some, assurances that probably were unrealistic. And we've referenced it a couple of times, but I think one of the more concerning things about this conflict is the lack of expertise that President Trump has around him. There need to be people that understand nuclear, for example, in these discussions, and there haven't been. And so if you're going to get to a place where you come up with a lasting formula for success, that has to be part of the equation, and we're not there yet.
There is so much market playing at the moment. There's so much, we would call it front running. There is so much pre-market chatter to save, put, the stock market back into the green, to put oil prices back into a relatively healthy place, that the people within the market are saying, do we believe the US president? And that is an extraordinary position to be in.
I don't know that the president is lying, but I don't know whether you can count on, to your point, Matt, that what he is saying is going to outlast the market day, right? But Israel is clearly advocating for this to continue. People like Senator Lindsey Graham clearly advocating for this to continue, and they're painting a picture of what success might look like. And again, without counter voices in the room giving them a dose of reality, I think it's quite difficult. And then, yes, you've got the Gulf on the other hand. There are reports over the last 24 hours that the Gulf is actually advocating for, to quote, finish the job, harkening back to this very vulnerable position that they're going to be in if we simply walk away from this and declare mission accomplished.
He comes up with these comments, he throws them out like popcorn, like confetti. And, when markets hinge on this, when war and peace hinges on this, when people are literally wondering whether they can get through the day or, another piece of ordnance will come down on their heads, whether you're a member of the regime or just an ordinary citizen trying to survive, between the rubble and the bombs in Tehran. And I think that's, Helia, why the markets, are not taking that seriously. And I think, Jen, that's where we have a problem going forward with either the Israelis believing him or the Iranians believing him or us believing him.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what he's fundamentally doing is throwing things at a wall and seeing what sticks. There is still hope that whether it is Karg Island, whether it is sending a Marine expeditionary unit, whether it is threatening infrastructure, all of these are a test to see which resonates and finds that perfect formula whereby it addresses domestic U.S. concern about the direction of this conflict. At the same time, brings it to a swift close. And so each of these are, test bombs.
And Jen, the US market has been remarkably resilient to all of Trump's ideas, whether it be the tariff war, whether it now be the war in Iran. There's been an incredible resilience given what is actually happening on the ground. When it comes to affordability in the US, when you've got, gas at the pump at, 5.80 a gallon in the US, then it starts to eke away at him. What's happening in the market starts to creep into what he's going to do. And I think it's that economic pain he has to address. So, yes, his messaging might be signaling, but he has to respond to it.
I mean, I guess one of the litmus tests of this 15-point plan, or of Trump's commitments and statements today on the tarmac, is whether the tankers are actually allowed through the Straits of Hormuz. And I'm not just talking about the ones that the Iranians have given the green light to, that belong to Pakistan and other countries in recent days. So do we know if the tankers are going through? And do you think that they would be wise to let them through?
I think this is, Iran's weapon right now in this war. And it would have to use this weapon strategically. To negotiate. Certainly, Iran might, if if it would need to, would allow some of the tanks to go through. As you say, a lot of the tankers are allowed to go through. And there's almost a one-on-one negotiation happening between different states, different companies, and Iran. In fact, this could be the beginning of a new Iranian sort of influence in the region. That Iran, this card that was always thought as being impossible, a card that was thought about, you'd never get there. They've gotten there. We're there now. So Iran might, even after this war ends, might always have this card now to deploy, to negotiate bilaterally, multilaterally, and certainly if it is being attacked in that war.
Renad, first you, what are you going to be looking out for in the next 5 days as the doomsday clock is being reset? What are you going to be looking out for specifically to see whether this is more substantial than what the skeptics might think?
I think the one thing to look out for is sort of the economic activity. I think Iran has very much made the economy and the strait and the waterways its battlefield. And so the extent to which that battlefield changes would give a sort of sense of where the Iranians are willing to go and to negotiate beyond the rhetoric that we have on social media or in Iranian state channels.
Joan, what about you? What will you be looking out for?
I'll be looking for the markets to close on Friday. This is a 5-day reprieve of the threat to take out power infrastructure. And my understanding is that our military assets are also due to arrive in about 5 days. I suspect there is not a coincidence. And so it does provide a window. If Iran is open to de-escalating, then we'll see some of the things maybe that Renad is talking about. But I think the real test will come Friday night. And we'll get a better sense of which direction the administration wants to take this and who succeeded in whispering in the right ear this week.
If for some reason it all goes horribly wrong by Friday or the weekend, I mean, the markets are going to have a terrible day on Monday, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were some suggestions from Citi that oil could go beyond $200 a barrel, and that kind of doomsday scenario is definitely on the cards if it's not shown to resolve. And I think every week you are seeing this volatility of bounce back. The pricing in of the risk becomes higher. But Matt, just, you don't need it to go badly. Inflation will already go higher. And for me, it will be looking at how the implications of that for consumers, for companies, for different countries across the world. And whatever happens in the next 5 days, some of that, unfortunately, is already baked in.
Thanks very much to all of you. Helia Ebrahimi, our economics editor, Renad Mansour, Chatham House, and Jen Gavito, formerly of the State Department. Thanks to all of you. Absolutely fascinating. That's it from the Fourcast here in Jerusalem.